Alright, so since I covered a typical RBAC or an authorization flow in the previous video, it only makes sense to also look at authentication. Again, this is not a proper hands-on tutorial. I already have content around it on my channel. What I want to do here is take you through a typical flow and the best practices or even industry standards used around it. Now, even before authentication, you ideally would want to register yourself. A typical sign up or a register request from the client would normally take a unique user identifier that could be email, a unique username, a phone number, or something similar. Along with this, you'll also be asked to provide other random meta information based on the platform, and the most important bit is a password. Now, client only handles basic format specific validation, like password should have a character count limit or should have some type of special characters to make it more robust. Email would also have a regular expression pattern that needs to be followed, but eventually the security is all handled on the backend. So this takes me to step 2, which is server-side validation. So typically on the server, you'd normally first serialize your email, as in turn it into a lowercase string, trim it to avoid empty spaces, and do more such similar normalization. You also would want to enforce password policies like minimum length to make it more difficult for the password to be cracked, and also a max length policy. This max length policy is actually very underrated because it's used to prevent a DOS attack, a denial of service attack. So I'll take you through an example. Say for instance, you have no limit on your password field and an attacker sends a login request with a password that's a 10 MB string. It's a huge password. Now the server is going to accept it and hash it with the help of bcrypt, argon2 or such similar hashing algorithms. I will come to this hashing bit in a minute, but for now, imagine that when you enter a password, there's some sort of encryption that's required, and you can think of hashing as that encryption in this particular scenario. Even before hashing, you'd also normally apply different kinds of processing strategies on your password to normalize it, which tends to put a load on the CPU and the memory. And if you repeat this thousands of times, the CPU now is at 100% utilization and legitimate users can't even log in. This now makes your app look like it's down. So unlike your typical denial of service attack where there's so many requests coming in that there's no more bandwidth left to pick up new requests, this is more of a computational denial of service where systems are now stuck trying to resolve heavy operations. So even a small number of users could bring down your system with this. So yeah, a max length validation is equally important in the case of passwords. You also would ideally check if a user already exists and only move forward if that's the case. So all of these validations happen on the server before actually creating the user. So now we have already gone through the validation steps. But obviously when you enter a password in order to register an account, you would not want to store these passwords as it is because anyone who has access to the database can use these passwords and pose as someone else, which is extremely dangerous. You instead would want to hash all of your passwords. Now hashing and encryption are two different things. People actually tend to get confused between hashing and encryption. So let me quickly clear it up. Encryption is two-way. When I say two-way, what I mean is if I convert a string into something gibberish with the help of encryption, it can be brought back to the original string using a decryption key, which hackers do often tend to find from the config files inside your project. If an attacker has access to the database, they basically have access to all the passwords. Hashing is a bit better because behind the scenes, it uses a hashing algorithm to convert your passwords again into something completely gibberish, but this time it's not reversible. This hash string is what gets stored in the database. Next time when the user tries to log in, the same hashing process is applied on the password and the hash strings are now compared to see if they are the same. This way, you don't have to store plain text passwords, and since there is no way to decrypt this hash, even if the user gets access to the database, they won't really know what to do with it. But there's still a problem though. There's this thing called a rainbow table that has hash strings for the most common passwords out there. So if an attacker compares your database hash strings to the rainbow table hash strings, they might actually be able to figure out some of the passwords in the database. So to make this a bit more secure, you'd normally see a salt-based hashing, which basically attaches a random string to your hash string so that these rainbow tables become completely obsolete. These salts are unique for each user. So if the rainbow table has a hash string for say QWERTY, imagine that someone has QWERTY as their password. With the salt that you have attached to this hash string, now it's not going to match. But again, there are ways to tackle this as well, like with the help of a dictionary brute force attack. I'm obviously skipping a lot of internals here because I myself am not an expert on these topics, and I clearly have moved away from the main topic, which is authentication. So if you want to know more about all of these security password storage techniques, I would highly recommend you to go watch Alex's video on exactly that. It's quite interesting to see how progressively the strategies have gotten better over a period of time, and he explains it very, very well. But the basic idea here is to never store the passwords in plain text and apply hashing strategies to make it difficult for an attacker to crack your passwords. Now the step 4 is where actual user creation happens. Once all of this is done, once the validation and the password hashing is done, the user is added to the database. Now that the user is added to the database, they are still not authenticated yet. There are no sessions or tokens in place yet. The next step is actually a very common strategy that you basically see in all production applications, that is email-based verification. So once a user is added to the database, you normally see email-based verification for that user. This email-based verification happens right after you register, and it actually avoids a few common issues. Number 1, your email will not be taken by someone else for registration. Before this email-based verification, that used to happen quite a lot. Number 2, eventually when you do forget your password, which happens to pretty much everyone, email is where you get your reset password links. This email-based verification step though doesn't really have anything to do with security. It's just to bind an account to an email inbox. Now you might also ask that why create a user first and then email verify? Like why add an entry in the database before verifying the user? Why not do the verification first and then create a user? It is a fair question, yes. But you see, anytime a user is created, there is a verification token that's stored in a separate database, which normally expires in a day or so. So there are a lot of applications out there that will automatically log you in once you register, but they will not give you access to the entire application. Some parts of the application will be hidden or will have a restricted access message or a banner, and it will only be activated once you verify. So based on this use case, it actually makes sense to create the user first and then verify them, because a user still has access to the application. It's just that some parts of the application are restricted. And that's primarily the reason why user creation happens first and verification happens after it. One more reason why you'd want to create a user before this verification step is probably to rate limit the user. Also, if for whatever reason the verification link doesn't work, you can have a retry/resend mechanism, and this can be done through email, which happens in the user creation step. The email is mapped to the user in the user creation step, and you can send all kinds of links after it. So these are like a bunch of reasons why you see verification happen after user creation. Now coming back to the email verification step, we now have the token hash mapped to the user ID. What is actually sent to the email is a URL with a raw token. So you will have a URL, which in most cases would be an API request, a GET request. When the user clicks the link, a GET request gets triggered. Nothing is really updated on the backend with this GET request. This request is just to validate the token. The reason why it's typically implemented this way is to avoid accidental clicks or even email scanners. So apparently many email providers like Gmail, Outlook, or even these corporate email gateways will open links automatically to scan for malware. Now if your verification happens on the GET request itself, email will be verified before the user even clicks on it. So in this GET request, the server will hash the token, look it up in the database, the verification token database, validate the expiry of the token, and also check whether this token has already been used, but it will not actually verify the user. In response to this request, you will actually get a page which has a button that says click to confirm email or something similar. Once you actually click on this button, a post request will be made. This is obviously a user initiated request. The server again hashes the token, again validates its existence, again checks the expiry, and also checks whether it's used or not. And if all of these conditions are met, now it's actually going to mutate the database. It's actually going to verify your account. And this action, this particular action of verifying your account is irreversible. Now from here, two things can happen depending on the application. So a lot of systems, as I mentioned earlier, auto login the user on registration. Even if they haven't verified their account, they're still allowed to navigate the app, and some parts of the app are restricted, which can only be accessed after the email verification. So if you are auto logged in, the token now becomes outdated. This token will have email verified flag set to false, which also has to change. So there are systems in place that either force a re-login, which in my personal opinion is a very bad experience, but the industry standard is to issue a new access token. This is what basically most single page applications do. They'll validate the verification token, they'll update the database by setting the email verified flag with the timestamp of when it happened. They'll also check if the request has a valid session. This means that the user is auto-logged in. If that is the case, they'll generate a new access token, they'll keep the same session, they'll keep the same refresh token, but with updated parameters for email verification. Now I know I'm not really come to the access token, the refresh token or the sessions bit yet, but just remember, you can only access the application based on the access token, which you get when you successfully sign in. I'll come to the login flow in just a minute, but keep this in mind. Now, if there is no auto login flow, then it's straightforward. Then on a registration, you'll see a toast message or a modal that will tell you to check your email and verify your account. It will probably redirect you to the login page, but it's still going to wait for you to verify your account. There is also a chance that it may not even let you log in before verification. That way you will not face this problem of an outdated token. You'll get a fresh token once you verify through email, and then you'll be able to log in. Perfect. You have now successfully created an account and you're also verified. Now imagine that the app does not have an auto login mechanism. So it's time to go to the login page and sign in. This is the next step, which is actually making a login request from the client.